Hello, friends. Lori sat on the edge of the motel room bed, her foot tapping against the thin carpet in a frantic rhythm. The air in the room was stifling, filled with the heavy scent of air fresheners struggling to mask decades of use. The single window let in faint neon light from the sign outside, casting the space in an eerie glow. She checked her phone again, 6:47 p.m. Nate was late. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through her texts, finding nothing but her own messages to him, marked read. Her stomach churned with unease. The tiny clock on the bedside table ticked louder with each passing second. The vibration of her phone jolted her. Lori's breath caught in her throat. Her husband rarely called this time of day unless it was something important. Hesitant, she answered, forcing her voice into a calm she didn't feel. Havens. What's up? Where are you? I just got off early and thought I'd swing by and join you and the girls. His voice was cheerful, oblivious. Lori's mind raced. We're still at the theater, she lied, clutching the phone tightly. Her heart thundered in her chest. The show's running long, you know how those things go. There was a pause, and for a moment, she feared he would ask for proof, maybe demand to speak to one of her friends. All right, he finally said. Have fun. Call me when you're done. She hung up, letting out a shaky breath, and tossed the phone on the bed. Panic laced her thoughts. If Vince showed up at the theater, her flimsy cover story would collapse. But what could she do? She was already here, waiting for Nate, a man who wasn't her husband. She paced the room, rubbing her arms as the nerves crawled beneath her skin. Another glance at the phone. Still no messages. The minutes dragged until a knock on the door startled her. She froze. This was it. She smoothed her dress and crossed the room, her heart pounding as she opened the door. But instead of Nate, a teenage motel employee stood there, clutching a package. Delivery for you, he mumbled, handing her the envelope. Lori frowned, glancing down at the name scribbled on the front. Her name. She opened it cautiously, finding a small slip of paper inside. Scrawled in bold letters, "You're making a mistake." Her breath hitched. Who gave you this? She demanded, her voice trembling. The boy shrugged. Some guy at the desk. Said to give it to the lady in room 214. She slammed the door shut, her mind reeling. What was going on? Her phone buzzed again, and she snatched it up. A new text from an unknown number. It's not too late to turn back. She sank onto the bed, clutching the phone. Was Vince onto her? Was Nate playing some kind of game? Or worse, was someone else watching? A soft rustle outside the door made her jump. She crept to the peephole, peering through. The hallway was empty, but a shadow flickered at the far end. Her pulse raced as she locked the deadbolt and turned the flimsy chain for good measure. When her phone buzzed again, she nearly dropped it. Another message from the unknown number. Do you trust him? Who the hell are you? She typed back, her fingers shaking. She waited, but no response came. The room felt smaller with every passing moment, the walls pressing in on her. Finally, another knock at the door. This time, she hesitated before approaching, her heart hammering in her chest. Who is it? She called, her voice cracking. It's me, came Nate's voice, low and reassuring. Relief washed over her as she unlatched the door and let him in. Sorry I'm late, he said, stepping inside. Had to be careful. Lori opened her mouth to speak, but something about his expression stopped her. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting around the room. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, he replied too quickly. We don't have much time. She reached for his arm. Nate, are you okay? Did something happen? He avoided her gaze, pacing the room. Lori, I need to ask you something. Have you told anyone about us? No, of course not, she said, her confusion mounting. Why? His jaw tightened. Because someone knows. I got a message, no, a warning, on my way here. Lori's stomach dropped. A warning? From who? I don't know, Nate said, his voice rising. But whoever it is, they're watching us. They know we're here. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. He's not who you think he is. She showed Nate the message, her hands trembling. His face darkened as he read it. What the hell is this? He muttered, pacing again. Maybe we should just leave, Lori said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is too risky. But before they could decide, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed outside the door. Both of them froze, their eyes locked. Nate motioned for Lori to stay quiet as he approached the peephole. He cursed under his breath. It's Vince. Her blood ran cold. What? She whispered, backing away. I don't know how he found us, but he's out there, Nate hissed, his voice tight with fear. Another knock, this one harder, more insistent. Lori, I know you're in there, Vince called, his voice edged with anger. Lori's mind raced. How had it all gone so wrong? And now, trapped in a motel room with her lover, the truth about to explode, she realized there was no turning back. The moment Nate stepped into the room, Lori's tension melted like frost under the morning sun. I could see her entire posture change. Her shoulders dropped, and the breath she'd been holding came out in a soft exhale. Nate shut the door behind him, his hand lingering on the knob as if he wasn't quite ready to face her. You're late, she said, though her tone was teasing rather than accusatory. I know. I'm sorry, he replied, pulling her into his arms without another word. For a moment, it was as though the world outside that motel room ceased to exist. She buried her face in his chest, and they stood there, two people holding on as if letting go wasn't an option. Finally, she stepped back, looking up at him. I thought something had happened. You scared me. It wasn't easy getting here, he admitted. His eyes darted to the window, as though checking for any sign of movement outside. But I'm here now. She smiled, a small, tentative thing, and gestured toward the room's lone chair. Sit. You look like you've been running. He shook his head, pulling her toward the bed instead. They sat side by side, close enough that their knees touched. Lori reached out, running her fingers along the edge of his jaw. It was a gesture that spoke of familiarity, of countless shared moments that hadn't yet worn thin. Tell me, she began, her voice soft. What are we doing, Nate? Really? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm yet gentle. We're surviving, Lori. And dreaming about something better. Something better, she echoed. Her gaze grew distant, her mind clearly wandering to the picture they'd painted together in stolen conversations. The coast, Nate said, his voice warming as he spoke. Somewhere warm. A little house near the water. No schedules, no stress. Just us. Lori's eyes lit up, her smile growing. We could open a cafe, she added. You could cook. I don't know, decorate or something. He laughed, the sound low and comforting. You'd burn the coffee every morning just so I'd have to do it? Maybe, she teased. But it'd still be ours. For a while, they sat like that, exchanging whispered dreams that felt impossibly fragile and yet, for them, all too real. I could almost see the life they imagined. A sunlit kitchen, salty air drifting in through open windows. It was all there, hovering just out of reach. And then the knock came. Sharp, sudden, and entirely out of place, it shattered the intimacy like a stone through glass. Lori jumped, her hand flying to her chest. Nate was on his feet instantly, his expression darkening as he moved toward the door. Wait, Lori whispered, grabbing his arm. Who could it be? He shook his head. Stay back. The knock came again, louder this time. Lori's phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she glanced at it, her face draining of color. It's him, she said, her voice barely audible. Vince? Nate's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Lori nodded, clutching her phone. He sent a message. He knows. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a grim expression, Nate motioned for Lori to stay put. She obeyed, retreating to the far corner of the room as he approached the door. Who is it? Nate called, his voice calm but firm. You know who it is, came the reply. Vince's tone was measured, controlled, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of anger beneath the surface. Nate hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, he turned back to Lori. I'll handle it, he said, though I could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. Lori shook her head. But just let him think I'm not here. But it was too late. Vince pounded on the door again, harder this time. I know you're in there, Lori. Open the door, or I'll... He didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of his threat hung in the air. Nate straightened, his jaw tightening. "I can't let him do this," he muttered before swinging the door open. Vince stood there, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. His eyes flicked past Nate, landing on Lori, who was now standing frozen by the window. The silence that followed was deafening. "So it's true," Vince said finally, his voice cold. "You really did this to me." Lori stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Vince, save it," he snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses." Nate moved to stand between them, his posture protective. "Look, man, this isn't the time or place." Vince's gaze shifted to Nate, his expression hardening. "You don't get to tell me anything," he growled. "You think you can just waltz in and steal my wife? Maybe we should take this somewhere else," Nate suggested, his tone steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "No," Vince said, his voice rising. "We're going to settle this here and now." The situation teetered on the edge of chaos, and for a moment, I wasn't sure which way it would fall. Lori stood helplessly by, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as the two men squared off. "Nate," she finally said, her voice breaking. "Don't." But Vince wasn't interested in hearing anything else. "I gave you everything, Lori," he said, his voice shaking. "And this is how you repay me?" The words hung heavy in the air, a raw and open wound that no one dared touch. And then, just as quickly as the storm had risen, it seemed to dissipate. Vince's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked less like an angry husband and more like a man utterly defeated. "You made your choice," he said quietly, his gaze locking onto Lori one final time. "Now live with it." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. Lori sank onto the bed, her face buried in her hands as Nate stood silently by, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily over them both. Nate stood by the door, still as stone, as Vince's footsteps faded down the hallway. The weight of what had just happened was palpable, suffocating. Lori sat on the bed, her head in her hands, her shoulders trembling. I could see she was struggling to hold herself together, but neither of us spoke. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the motel's outdated air conditioner. The knock on the door that followed wasn't loud, but it might as well have been a gunshot. Lori flinched, her head snapping up, her face pale. Nate turned toward the door, his body stiffening as though bracing for impact. "Don't," Lori whispered, her voice trembling. "Whoever it is, don't answer." But Nate didn't listen. Maybe he thought Vince had come back, ready for round two, or maybe he thought ignoring it would only make things worse. Either way, he stepped forward and opened the door. Sarah was standing there. She didn't charge in, not at first. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her dark eyes locked onto Nate with a fury so cold it made my skin crawl. Lori froze, her breath hitching audibly as she recognized the woman. "Are you going to invite me in, Nate?" Sarah asked, her voice deceptively calm, a razor-thin veneer over something far more dangerous. Nate hesitated, his hands still on the doorknob. "Sarah, this isn't the time." "Not the time," she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. Then, without waiting for permission, she shoved past him into the room. Her eyes swept over the space before landing on Lori, who was still sitting on the bed, as if frozen in place. "Wow," Sarah said, her voice louder now, every word dripping with venom. "So it's true. You're here with her." "Sarah, you don't understand," Nate started, but she spun on him so fast that he stumbled back a step. "Don't even start," she snapped. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, I noticed the faint sheen of tears in her eyes. Nate ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of frustration and guilt. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Sarah laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Oh, I shouldn't be here? Where should I be, Nate?" "At home, wondering why my husband isn't answering his phone?" "Guess what? I was. And then I got a little tip-off about where you might be." Lori's eyes widened, and she glanced at Nate. "You told her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course he didn't," Sarah spat, her gaze cutting to Lori like a knife. "You think he's that honest?" "Someone else had to tell me." "You're not as sneaky as you think, Nate." Sarah, Nate said, his voice low and pleading. Let's just go somewhere and talk about this. Oh, now you want to talk? Sarah said, stepping closer to him. Where was this need to talk when you decided to sneak around behind my back? Where was it when you lied to my face for God knows how long? Lori finally found her voice. I didn't know, she stammered. I didn't know he was lying to you. Sarah turned on her, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. You didn't know, she repeated, her voice rising. What exactly didn't you know? That he has a wife? That he's been doing this for years? Or did you just not care? Lori looked away, her face crumpling. Don't bother, Sarah interrupted. I've seen your type before. You think you're special, don't you? That you're the one who's going to make him happy, fix whatever's wrong in his life. Newsflash, he's not broken. He's just a liar. That's enough, Nate said sharply, stepping between them. You're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't helping. Sarah laughed again, shaking her head. Oh, now you're defending her? That's rich. I'm not defending anyone, Nate said, his voice tight. But this isn't the place for this. Where is the place for it, Nate? Sarah snapped. Because it sure as hell wasn't our home. You know, the place we built together? The life we were supposed to share? Her voice cracked again, and for a moment, the fury in her eyes gave way to something raw and vulnerable. It didn't last long. She turned back to Lori, her expression hardening once more. You should know, Sarah said, her voice quieter now but no less cutting. This isn't his first time. He's good at this. The lies, the secrets, the little fairy tales he spins about running away and starting over. Did he tell you about the coast? The little house by the water? That's his favorite. He's used it before. Lori looked at Nate, her face pale. Is that true? She asked, her voice barely audible. Nate didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. Lori's expression crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. Sarah took a step back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. You're a coward, she said to Nate, her voice trembling. You don't even have the guts to admit what you are. Nate's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, as if daring him to speak, and when he didn't, she turned on her heel and walked out. The door slammed behind her, leaving the room in stunned silence. Lori didn't look up. Nate didn't move. The weight of Sarah's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in the foundation they'd built their fragile world on. Sarah's exit felt like a hurricane leaving devastation in its wake. The room was eerily quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Lori sat motionless on the bed, her face buried in her hands, while Nate stood by the door, his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of the world. But the storm wasn't over. The door suddenly swung open again, slamming against the wall with a sharp crack. Sarah was back, and this time, she wasn't just angry, she was furious. Her eyes blazed as she stormed into the room, her fists clenched at her sides. Oh, we're not done here, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Lori stood up, her own anger rising to meet Sarah's. What do you want from me? She snapped, her voice shaky but defiant. I didn't know, okay? I didn't know he was lying to you. That's your excuse? Sarah shot back, her voice rising. You didn't know? Well, now you do. And yet here you are, standing in my way like you have some kind of right to him. Lori stepped closer, her hands balled into fists. I'm not standing in your way. If you want him so badly, take him. But don't come in here acting like this is all my fault. Nate raised his hands, trying to step between them. Hey, enough. Both of you stop. But neither woman was listening. They were like two storms colliding, and the tension in the room exploded into chaos. Sarah lunged first, grabbing a handful of Lori's hair and yanking hard. Lori screamed, her hands flying up to claw at Sarah's grip. You think you're so special? Sarah shouted, her voice shaking with fury. You're nothing but a homewrecker. And you're a psycho. Lori shot back, swinging wildly. The room erupted into a blur of flailing limbs and shouting. Lori managed to break free for a moment, but Sarah came at her again, her hands slapping against Lori's arms and shoulders. Lori retaliated, grabbing at Sarah's hair and pulling hard. Nate tried to step in, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Stop it! Both of you stop!" But Sarah spun around, her elbow catching Nate square in the ribs. He stumbled back with a grunt, clutching his side. "Sarah, enough!" he shouted, but she wasn't listening. Lori took advantage of the distraction, shoving Sarah backward. Sarah stumbled but quickly regained her balance, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're tough?" she snarled, charging at Lori again. This time, they both went down, crashing onto the bed in a tangle of limbs. Pillows flew, the lamp on the nightstand toppled to the floor, and the bed creaked ominously under their combined weight. "Stop it!" Nate yelled, grabbing at Sarah's shoulders to pull her off Lori. But as he did, Lori's arm swung out, her hand smacking him across the face by accident. "Damn it!" Nate shouted, stumbling back and clutching his cheek. "What the hell is wrong with you two?" Neither woman answered. They were too wrapped up in their own fury, their shouts blending into an incoherent jumble of accusations and insults. "You're pathetic," Sarah screamed, her nails digging into Lori's arm. "And you're insane." Lori shot back, shoving Sarah away with all her strength. Finally, Nate had had enough. He stepped forward, grabbing both of them by the arms and yanking them apart. "That's enough," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. Sarah and Lori froze, both of them panting and disheveled. Sarah's hair was a wild mess, and Lori had a red mark blooming on her cheek. Nate's face was flushed, and his eyes burned with anger. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice low and furious. "You're acting like children." Sarah wrenched her arm free from his grip, glaring at him with tears in her eyes. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she snapped. "You're the reason this is happening. You and your lies." Nate opened his mouth to respond, but Lori cut him off. "She's right, you know," she said, her voice trembling. "This is your fault. You lied to both of us. You made us believe in something that was never real." For a moment, Nate looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. He didn't have a defense. How could he? Sarah turned to Lori, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. "You can have him," she said, her eyes blazing. "He's not worth this. He's not worth anything." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Lori stood there for a moment, staring at the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Then she turned to Nate, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at the mess around them, the overturned lamp, the crumpled bedding, the broken pieces of their tangled lives. For the first time, he seemed to realize just how far they had all fallen. Lori stood frozen for a moment, her breath ragged, her eyes darting between the door Sarah had slammed and Nate, who still hadn't moved. The room was a disaster, a physical manifestation of the emotional carnage that had just unfolded. Lori's chest heaved as if she were struggling to breathe, but then something clicked. She grabbed her purse from the bedside table, muttering under her breath. "I'm done," she said, more to herself than to Nate. "Lori, wait," Nate called, his voice hollow and uncertain. He stepped toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she snapped, her voice trembling but resolute. "Don't say a word. This was a mistake." "All of it?" Nate's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked like a man watching a door close, knowing he'd never open it again. Lori didn't wait to hear what he might say. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The air outside hit her like a slap, cool and sharp against her flushed skin. The neon lights of the motel buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. She dug into her purse, fumbling for her keys, desperate to get out of there. But as she approached her car, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her stomach churned as her eyes took in the damage. The tires were flat, slashed, the rubber shredded and sagging against the asphalt. Worse, the side of her car was covered in bright red spray paint. The crude graffiti read, "Homewrecker." Lori stood there, stunned. The reality of what had just happened, the fight, Sarah's fury, Vince's accusations, crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Her fingers tightened around her keys as tears threatened to spill. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her voice cracking. She dropped her purse on the ground and crouched by the nearest tire, as if inspecting the damage up close would somehow make it less real. It didn't. The knife marks were deep, deliberate, and irreversible. Whoever had done this wanted to send a message, and it had landed loud and clear. Lori sat back on her heels, feeling the full weight of her exhaustion. It wasn't just the ruined car, it was everything. The lies, the guilt, the chaos she'd let herself get tangled in. She thought about Nate back in the room, still standing amidst the wreckage of their foolish affair. She thought about Vince, his face twisted with betrayal. And then there was Sarah, raging, broken, and somehow still strong enough to deliver the final blow. Lori swiped at her face, wiping away a stray tear. "No," she muttered to herself. "I'm not staying here. Not like this." She stood up and scanned the parking lot, her mind racing. A flatbed truck sat parked at the far end, its driver leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. Lori straightened her shoulders and marched over. "Hey," she called out, her voice firmer than she felt. The man looked up, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. "Do you have a tire iron I could borrow? Or anything to help with a flat?" He raised an eyebrow, taking a long drag on his cigarette before answering. "Lady, those tires ain't just flat, they're gone. You're not driving anywhere tonight." Lori's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Then can you give me a ride to a gas station? Or call a tow truck?" The man shrugged, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "Tow truck's your best bet. Closest gas station's 3 miles that way." He pointed down the dimly lit road. "But good luck getting anyone to pick you up this late." Lori exhaled sharply and pulled her phone from her purse. She could already imagine how this night would end, her sitting alone in the parking lot, waiting for a tow, while Nate watched from the window like a ghost haunting her mistakes. But when she turned on her phone, the battery icon blinked red. It died in her hand, the screen going black. "For God's sake," she hissed, throwing her head back in frustration. She looked at the man again, her desperation evident. "Please, just give me a ride." He hesitated, looking her up and down, before finally nodding. "Fine. Get in." The truck smelled like motor oil and stale coffee, but Lori didn't care. She sank into the passenger seat, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The man didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer explanations. They rode in silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional bump of the tires against the uneven road. At the gas station, Lori thanked him quietly and stepped out. She used the payphone to call a cab, then leaned against the wall, waiting under the flickering fluorescent lights. The night air was cold, biting through her thin sweater, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the night's events over and over until it felt like she might drown in them. When the cab finally arrived, Lori climbed in and gave the driver her address. The ride home was quiet, the city lights blurring past the window as she stared out, her thoughts too tangled to untangle. By the time the cab pulled up to her house, the sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. Lori stepped inside, closing the doors softly behind her. The house was silent, Vince's things untouched, the air heavy with the absence of him. She dropped her purse on the counter and sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she tried to catch her breath. The night had unraveled in ways she hadn't anticipated, and now she was left to face the wreckage. The slashed tires and graffiti felt like a metaphor for everything else. Irreparable damage, scars that couldn't be undone. The house was unnervingly quiet when Lori got home, the kind of silence that prickled at the back of her neck. She eased the door shut, careful not to make too much noise, though she wasn't sure why. Vince's car was in the driveway, she'd seen it, but the house itself felt empty, almost ominous. She set her keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, trying to compose herself. Her head was pounding, her body ached from the tension of the night, and the events at the motel felt surreal, like a fever dream she couldn't quite shake. She moved toward the kitchen, hoping to pour herself a glass of water and figure out what to say if Vince appeared. She didn't have to wonder for long. "Rough night?" Vince's voice came from the shadows of the living room. Lori spun around, her hand flying to her chest. Vince stepped into the light, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He looked calm, too calm, and that terrified her more than if he'd been shouting. "Vince," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't bother," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I already know. I've known for a while." Her heart sank, and she felt the color drain from her face. "What are you talking about?" He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that made her stomach twist. "Don't play dumb, Lori. I know about you and Nate. I've known for weeks." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. How could he have known? She thought back to every sneaky text, every hurried phone call, every excuse she'd given to cover her tracks. She thought she'd been so careful. "You think you're so clever," Vince continued, his voice sharp now, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "But you're not. You left breadcrumbs everywhere. And when I started noticing things, I decided to see how far you'd go." Lori's knees felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Vince, don't," he snapped. His voice was hard, unyielding. "You don't get to explain. Not after this." She swallowed hard, her mind racing. "If you knew, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront me sooner?" "Because I needed proof," he said simply, his tone cold and methodical. "Something solid. And tonight, I got it." It took a moment for his words to sink in, and when they did, her stomach turned to stone. "You set this up," she whispered. He smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Not exactly. But when Sarah called me, upset and looking for answers about her husband, I connected the dots. It wasn't hard to figure out. So, I gave her a little nudge." Lori's head spun. Sarah's arrival at the motel, the slashed tires, the chaos. It had all been orchestrated by Vince. "You wanted this to blow up," she said, her voice trembling. "You wanted it to end like this?" "Of course I did," Vince replied, his voice rising now. "You think I was going to sit back and let you keep lying to my face? Sneaking around with him, making a fool of me? I wanted you to see what happens when your perfect little fantasy comes crashing down." "Vince," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Stop," he barked, his voice echoing through the kitchen. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? That's your excuse? What, you just meant for it to be a harmless little fling? Some fun on the side while I sat here, clueless? Is that what you're saying?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I was thinking." "You weren't thinking," he shot back. "You were selfish. And you didn't care who you hurt?" She wiped at her face, the tears falling freely now. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand," he said, stepping closer, his eyes blazing. "I understand perfectly. You wanted something exciting, something new, and you didn't care about me. You didn't care about what it would do to us." "I cared," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "I cared, Vince. No," he interrupted, his voice cold again. "If you cared, you wouldn't have done it. You wouldn't have lied. You wouldn't have betrayed me." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Lori's breath came in shallow gasps, and Vince stood there, his chest heaving as he tried to rein in his anger. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "I'm done, Lori. I can't do this anymore." Her heart clenched. "What do you mean?" "I mean we're over," he said, his tone flat. "I'm filing for divorce." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Vince, no," she said, stepping toward him. "Please don't do this. We can fix this. We can." "There's nothing to fix," he said, stepping back. "You broke it, Lori. You broke us. And I'm done trying to put the pieces back together." She stood there, stunned, as he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. A moment later, she heard the bedroom door slam shut. Lori sank to the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. The enormity of what she'd done, what she'd lost, crashed down on her all at once. Vince's words echoed in her mind, each one a reminder of the damage she couldn't undo. And for the first time, she realized just how irreparably broken everything truly was. "Bye-bye."